Welcome back. This is day 1 of Unit 8, all about evolution. And today's aim is going to be, how does natural selection lead to the evolution of a new species? Let's find out. Before we get to that, you guys have got a do now question. So go ahead and pause this video and tell me, based on what you know already, and using the image below for reference, define evolution by natural selection. Right, so check out the text underneath this image and then tell me what's happening here and how does this relate to evolution? All right, pause this video and press play when you're ready to review it. So what do we see happening here? Well, we're told that a population of mice has just moved into a new area where the rocks are very dark. Due to natural genetic variation, some of these mice are black while others are tan. So these are still members of the same species, but due to different gene combinations that they have, some of them have black fur and some of them have tan fur. But how is this going to impact them in the long run? Well, what is the first thing you notice about this picture? Is that these black mice actually blend into their environment really well, right? They've got some natural camouflage because their fur is black and they're up against those black, dark gray rocks. So they blend in pretty easily. But these tan mice are not quite as lucky because if you are a bird scanning those dark rocks for food, the first thing you're going to notice is that tan mice. Or that tan mouse rather. So how is this going to impact them in the long run? Well, some of those mice are eaten by birds, and because the tan mice are more visible to those predatory birds than the black mice, tan mice are eaten at a higher frequency than the black mice. Now, only surviving mice are able to reach reproductive age and reproduce, and that means that those mice that are able to reproduce are going to pass on their traits to their offspring. Now, if you are a tan mice who has been eaten, you're not going to be passing on those traits, are you? But these black mice that have been able to survive and blend into their environment will reproduce. So those mice are going to reproduce, giving rise to the next generation. And because black mice had a higher chance of surviving and creating offspring than the tan mice, this next generation of mice contains a higher fraction of black mice than the previous generation. So we see that this generation has more black mice than they originally did. So this means that this species has changed over time. And guys, that's exactly what evolution is. It's just species changing over time. All right, so we now know what evolution is, but what is this word natural selection? Well, if we break it down, when we see this word natural, right, we're talking about nature or the environment. And when we see this word selection, we're talking about choosing one thing over another. Right? So what are we choosing over another? Well, we're choosing those key traits or those adaptations that are more beneficial to organisms. So when we see this word natural selection, we're literally talking about how the environment influences organisms' traits and what traits are passed on. So what do we need to know? I don't know why that's so far down, but that's okay. Natural selection is actually the process by which evolution occurs. Organisms who are better adapted to their environment will survive and grow to produce more offspring. This means that they're going to pass on those traits that have served them well. So over time, this causes species to change, and species changing is literally the definition of evolution. So now let's think about what would have happened if this situation was reversed. If this group of mice had moved into an area with tan rocks or tan sand, the opposite thing would have happened, right? Those birds would have been more likely to spot the black mice. So then over time, we would see higher frequencies of tan mice than black mice. So when we're talking about natural selection, we're talking about how the environment determines what traits are passed on, right? The environment determines what traits best suit the animals that are living in it. Right? So natural selection is the driving force behind evolution. Right. So let's first read a short introduction about Darwin and his theory of evolution. So the theory of evolution, which is just, as we said, change over time, by natural selection can be summarized as follows. There are 4 tenets we need to know. The first thing is that every population produces more offspring than can survive. that can survive in an environment with limited resources, known as overpopulation. Now, when we're talking about resources, we're talking about things like food, shelter, water, what resources are available in that environment. Now, all populations show variation in traits, right? This is what we know as genetic variation. So in the previous example, we saw that some mice were black, some mice were tan. There's that natural genetic variation present in species. And much of this variation is inherited, meaning it is passed on from their parents and can be passed on to their offspring. Now, in a given environment, individuals with traits that make them better suited to survive long enough to reproduce leave more offspring than individuals without these traits. So we saw in the previous example that the mice with black fur were more likely to survive and pass on that trait to their offspring. Now, over time, those inherited traits that improve the chance of survival and reproduction, called adaptations, become more common than other traits within a population. So we saw that in the ending example, we still had some mice with the tan trait, right? Because that genetic variation is still there. But the black fur became much more prevalent in that species because those were an adaptation that suited those mice well. It helped them survive and reproduce and produce more offspring with those same traits. So in other words, the population evolves, right? It changes. Natural selection is also commonly referred to as survival of the fittest. Now, when we see this word fittest, we're not talking about species that go to the gym most frequently. We're talking about species that have the best traits for their environment, right? Have the best traits or the best genes for their environment, right? Something that helps them survive and reproduce. Right, so let's now use this information to answer some questions. Starting with number one, what does this word, should be overpopulation. What does this word overpopulation refer to in the third line? So we read that overpopulation means that more offspring are produced than can survive in an environment with limited resources. And remember, when we saw this word resources, we're talking about food, we're talking about shelter. More organisms are produced than can survive. Now, define the word adaptation. So we saw that adaptations are inherited traits that improve the chances of survival and reproduction for a species. So in the first example, the black fur amongst those black rocks was an adaptation that helped the mice survive and reproduce and pass on those traits to their offspring. So now, how does natural selection lead to the evolution of a population? Well, natural selection is the driving force behind evolution. So the environment's going to choose which traits are passed on at a higher frequency, which causes those species to change over time. And that change over time is evolution. So now, why can natural selection also be called survival of the fittest? Remember, we're not talking about which species go to the gym most frequently. When we see that word fittest, we're talking about organisms that have the best traits for the environment or genes that allow them to survive. So natural selection involves passing down traits that allow the species to survive and reproduce over time. All right. Now, I've got two examples that we're going to work through together. So I've got a scenario for you. So there are two types of worms: worms that eat at night, called nocturnal, and worms that eat during the day, known as diurnal. Now, birds eat during the day and seem to only be eating the diurnal worms because the nocturnal worms are in their burrows during this time. They are hiding out. So each spring when the worms reproduce, they have about 500 babies, but only 100 of these 500 ever become old enough to reproduce. So right now we're seeing overpopulation, right? There's more worms than there are resources. There's not enough food to feed all these worms. So what is happening here? We see that there's natural selection occurring against, against diurnal worms and for nocturnal worms, right? Because we see that because these birds are eating during the day, they are targeting those diurnal worms that are trying to live their life during the day. But those nocturnal worms that are hiding out during the day aren't getting eaten quite as frequently because they are not around when the birds are hungry. So let's look at what Darwin's 5 points are here. So we saw that, is there population variation? Yes, right? We saw that there are two variations of worms. There's the nocturnal worms that are, that are awake during, I said alive, that are awake at night. Then there's the diurnal worms that are awake during the day. But in this example, what is the favorable variation? Well, we see that nocturnal worms are actually the favored variation here for worms because those diurnal worms are getting eaten by the birds. Now, are more offspring produced than can survive? Yes, right? We read that about 500 worms are produced, but only 100 have the resources to survive. So we see that overpopulation is happening. So what is surviving with the favorable traits? Those nocturnal worms are surviving at a higher rate because again, they are hiding out when when the birds are hungry. So over time, will we see this population change? Yes, we will see that as those nocturnal worms survive and reproduce, they're producing more nocturnal worms, but the diurnal worms, because they're getting eaten more frequently, aren't going to reproduce quite as frequently, which means over time, we're going to see that change in the species where we'll have more nocturnal worms than diurnal worms surviving and reproducing. All right, scenario number 2. So there are 3 types of polar bears, ones with thick coats, ones with medium coats, and ones with thin coats. Now it's fall, soon to be winter. Not anymore, it's spring now, but the temperatures are dropping rapidly, meaning it's going to get cold pretty fast. And the bears must be kept warm or they will freeze to death. Aww. So many of the bears had approximately 2 cubs each, but due to the extreme temperatures, many mothers have only 1 cub left. So again, this is another example of overpopulation where there are more organisms being produced than there are resources to take care of them. So there is clearly natural selection happening here, right? Those temperatures are dropping rapidly, which means it's gonna get cold. Think about you, okay? If you are outside with nothing but like a windbreaker on, you're gonna get cold really fast. But if you've got like a puffer coat on, you're nice and warm, you're nice and cozy, you're good to go. So what's happening here with the bears? They can't put on an extra coat. They are stuck with the one that they've got. So natural selection is going to be selecting against those medium and thin coats for the thick coats, because as winter comes, the bears with thick coats are going to be more likely to survive and reproduce than the ones with the thin coats, right? Those are going to be freezing and sadly dying of hypothermia. So let's look at Darwin's 5 points here. Are there natural variations? Yes, we see that there are 3 varieties of coats here. There's thin coats, there's medium coats, there's thick coats. Is there favorable variation? Yes, the thick coat is what is being selected for in this environment as natural selection runs its course. So are there more offspring produced than survive? Yes, right? We saw that each of the bears have approximately 2 cubs, but only 1 survives the winter. So what is going to survive with the favorable trait here? Those organisms with medium or thick coats, specifically the ones with thick coats, are going to be more likely to survive and reproduce, but some of the medium coats will survive. So will we see the population changing? Yes, we're going to see that over time, the bears with thick and or medium coats are going to be more likely to survive and pass on those traits, while those with thin coats are not going to survive the winter quite as frequently and aren't going to pass on those traits. So we will see these species change over time or evolve as they adapt to have more thick coats, right? Right. And that is all I've got for you guys today. So, oh no, wait for it. All right, guys, go ahead and complete your exit ticket. It is these 2 questions. So go ahead and submit your exit ticket and these notes on Google Classroom and have a wonderful day. If you have any questions about this, please let me know on Remind. But I know evolution can be super confusing at first, but again, we will be talking about this over the next few weeks, and hopefully it will start to make a little bit more sense. Have a wonderful day, and I will see you guys soon.